And that enables Rousseau then to argue that in a civic society, religion becomes a civic religion. Religion controlled, directed, its role, it's the confines of its role defined by the state. This is very different from the model that we have here in the United States, in which we talk about a state keeping an equal distance away from all religious involvement. And if it gets religiously involved, it must become equally involved with all religions at the same time. This is sort of the Stuart Mill type model as opposed to a Rousseau model. And in the Rousseau model, for people of faith, because ultimately the question that all of us was presented for, as Muslims compare the US to Europe and so on, for people of faith, living the civic religion model, the model, the Rousseauan model, the model of the state as sort of the ultimate and absolute source of goodness in itself, is the one that has prevailed since colonialism in all Middle Eastern countries, without exception. Well, with the exception of even Saudi Arabia has its own quirks, but definitely the idea of the civic religion model, and that enables the state to act with a sense of absoluteness and unequivocalness and non-relativity in terms of its own legitimacy. Its legitimacy is absolute, not relative. And its process is all the goodness, not part of the goodness. But at the same time, it severely limits the potentiality of grace, the power or the potential that comes from a voluntarily individual recognition of divinity. Quite often in the Rousseauan model, we end up arguing about very positive law type issues, like, well, what religion has made it as part of the civic religion, and what religion is still of an unknown status. And this is exactly where what you see in France and other European countries like Switzerland involving Muslims. Often you read the arguments that, well, we don't really know if Muslims are part of the civic religion because Muslims, with all due respect to human rights tradition and so on, that Muslims have not proven that they're capable of being a part of the civic religion tradition, and their status therefore is tentative and negotiable. While older faith communities, Jewish and Christian, are argued to be already a part of the civic religion tradition because they have a history. A very lawyerly way of approaching the issue, and very different than the way we approach it in the United States, where we don't make judgments about which religion has made it as part of the civic fabric. We assume all religions to be on an equal footing. The European Courts of Human Rights has a case in which if you're interested in this material, it's discussion of whether limitations on religious practices in some European countries involving Muslims, for the most part, but there are cases involving other communities, especially Haitian religions and African religions and so on, whether they violate the human rights tradition or not. Now, if you compare that to some of our own cases, the discourse is fascinating. Often in the European Court of Human Rights, the discussion goes as follows. Well, human rights is a grand idea and so on, but it is so huge, so amorphous, that we really should talk about European conceptions of human rights, which I think is a contradiction in terms. Either human rights are universal or they're not universal, but human rights cannot be European. Then they're just European rights, not human rights. Or they cannot be African, then they're African rights, not human rights. But anyway, the courts often argue that, well, we should then talk about, because human rights is so amorphous, it's so grand, when no one really knows what it means, we must stay limited to the specific tradition of Europe. And because we don't know what the specific tradition of Europe is, then we must stick to the European Convention of Human Rights, the actual legal language of the European Convention of Human Rights. And since we stick to the actual legal language of the European Convention for Human Rights, then it becomes an issue of whether this language incorporates the notion of civic religion and the right of the state, the legitimate power of the state, according to this view, of defining the role that is religion going to occupy in public space. For those of you, for instance, who have wondered why secularists in Egypt can claim to be secularists but have the Sheikh of Azhar stand there and support a coup, the reason comes from the French tradition, not from the Muslim tradition. It comes from the French tradition that the religion, that the state can define the space that religion can play. And since Azhar has a traditional historical role in Egypt, the Egyptian Supreme Court has said the Coptic Church and the Azhar University can be part of the secular practice of the state. To illustrate just one step further, there were some new Christian churches that have emerged in Egypt, and very much like the French tradition or the textualist tradition, Protestant Christian churches or Mormon Christian churches or Jehovah's Witnesses and so on. And the Egyptian Supreme Court said, well, these churches do not have the same position as the Coptic Church, because the Coptic Church has a history and a tradition that allows it to be part of the civic religion of the country, while these churches have not achieved access to that status. That ultimately sacrifices, in my view, the principle of human rights itself, the freedom that thinking about human rights as equivalent to a state of blessing or a state of grace or a state of ultimate goodness. In my writings, I call it a state of beauty. To a specific textualist or historical context that I find suffocating and so limiting. And dangerous, ultimately dangerous, because it consistently puts religion itself in the service of the state, which becomes, for all practical matters, the secular God. Roberto Unger has this article where he says, modern human beings have become uprooted and unsettled, and we have people popping pills everywhere, and human beings it means depression pills, and anxiety pills, and human beings are so miserable. What is the solution, according? It says that we develop a secular religion of divine human beings. Very Nietzsche type like thought, in the sense that, well, if we convince human beings that they're gods, and that because they're gods, we don't need a god. It reminds me very much of the whole history of nationalist secularism, and that is a critical distinction. And let me, I know something like this, I should leave plenty of time for questions. And please, if do feel free to say something. Can you please re-explain everything you said if you want? Because I know that this is not easy stuff, but there is a critical point that we are going through right now. As we've all heard of the Arab Spring, which is a term invented by Western media, whether it's spring or winter or fall or I don't know, who cares? But the point though is that we have at this critical juncture an ongoing battle as to how to relate to the human rights tradition. Some refer to the Rousseau secular nationalist model of, well, you allow the state to control the space for religion, and basically repeating the whole dynamic, and exactly like what we saw in the coup in Egypt, and the state becomes ultimately the beginning and the end of what human rights and what religion both, and the role that they should play. Compared to that, there has been various movements and various theorists in Syria or Jordan and Tunisia, Yemen, argued that, in fact, the model of the nationalist state, which is staunchly secularist, but also controls the role or the space allowed for religion, ultimately ends up, if it works, ends up supporting or at the very best, when it's doing its utmost, is that it gives victory to the idea of civic rights as opposed to human rights. The human rights and we often confuse the two in our own discourses. Civic rights are the rights that you have within your national boundaries because of a constitutional document or because of a system of rights, whether it's a Bill of Rights or whatever the source. Human rights is literally that. Rights that all human beings are entitled to. And our own role in supporting or opposing governments or movements is very critical. When we come to countries that have a very strong statist tradition, and a tradition, at least in the modern age, countries in which the state is the possessor of truth, the controller of truth, the state is the definer, literally, of the space that God placed, and so on, and we support that position, I don't think we are doing any favors for the human rights tradition. At best, if things work well for us, we are supporting a civic rights tradition. And that's a critical distinction, and a distinction that religious thinkers often fail to think about, to even appropriately understand. Either we uphold the principle of human rights in its absoluteness, in its universality, in its blind stand towards justice or towards equality of causes, in its non-responsiveness to the element of who you sympathize with as a human being or not. So, for instance, I always play this trick with my students. I give them a story involving a horrible narrative, a true story, about people who got tortured, destroyed, blah, 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 and so on. And then, but I change their identity from, if the group in the original story were Muslim, I make them Christian. If they were Christian, I make them Muslim. And I get the responses of the students. And once they've committed them to writing, I tell them the actual identity. And then I get the responses again. And that change in response, the subtle change in language of how you see what is right and wrong, is the space where the lack of grace shows up, where the true space of your inner darkness shows up, and the space where the hypocrisy between civic rights and human rights show up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And if you want to, I think yeah, this mic should be working. Yeah. Thank you so much. So we have now a time for questions, and as we were told, it is important to actually come to the microphone because other people not in this room actually are listening to this session. And so to give you time maybe to think of questions, I would like to, and actually, I just want to say how amazingly appropriate what you said, because yesterday evening we were talking about France and the US, and I thought that what you just shared was such an amazing contribution to our discussion yesterday evening. So thank you so much. Although you were not here, but really that was really amazing. My question is about the word value. I would really like, I'm in that discussion on human rights, and especially because I'm from Europe, so we often use that term value. And I feel that often this is a term that people use them to say, well, there is no way that we can live together. So I would really be interested in knowing as how you as a lawyer also, and how this actually plays into the current situation, and how would you use the word value even in that context of natural laws, divinity, etc. Is there anything we can draw from the concept of value, because it seems to be very negatively used right now in Muslim, especially in Muslim Christian relations?
I mean, the question about value, and interestingly, this whole discussion about the existence or non-existence of values, usually existence or non-existence about values about human rights or values about democracy, or goes back throughout the history of Islam and Christianity. And I would think in every confrontation that human beings have taken something beautiful and twisted it to be an expression, an extension of their own egos, you'll find the same. But fundamentally, a value is about connotes what one considers to be a norm, and not a norm enforceable by threat of the use of force, as in the case of law, but by an internal impulse. of compliance and what makes one consider something normative and binding, or makes something not normative and not binding. And the remarkable thing about the whole idea of values, and this is a discussion I have in Muslim context as well as interreligious context and all of that, is the assumptions we make about values are often an extension of our sentiment in the historical period in which we stand. In other words, if we believe we are born with a respect for human beings, we will often say, well, that's what I feel, and all those similar to me feel likewise, and we are the norm, and then the question is whether the other has it. And I think that paradigm is fundamentally flawed, because if we look at a history of all major religions, and let me stick to Islam and Christianity, on every issue, whether issue of rights, let's say, the notion of rights as a value emerges, as far as we can tell, for the first time, I mean, from a scholarly perspective, from a Muslim perspective, it emerges with the Prophet, but I'm talking from a more academic perspective. From an academic perspective, it emerges in the 3rd Islamic century or the 9th Christian era or Common Era, and it is expressed in the notion of hukuk. And haq literally means a right, what you own as a matter of justice. And the Muslim theologians at the time initiated the idea that there are rights that belong to God, and rights that belong to people, and rights that belong to a married couple, and rights that belong to, then it was picked up by lawyers who co-opted this discourse in a legal paradigm, and you find in medieval texts these extensive discussions about what are the rights of God, what are the rights of human beings, and whether the state can enforce the right of God or not, whether the state can forgive a right that belongs to God or not. And interestingly, most jurists in Islamic history said the state the state cannot enforce the rights of God because it connotes that God is incompetent or God is unable to fulfill God's own rights. And these discourses connote a historical understanding of rights, a debate that we in the modern age, when I say we, I mean including Muslims, have completely lost touch with. But at the same time, we find different periods in Islamic history where basically the notion of rights completely disappeared. And I would make the same argument about Christianity. The notion of rights, I mean, when I remember the theological readings about slavery and the debates in England between theologians who thought that nothing could be more offensive to natural law than slavery, and those who believe that actually nothing could be more consistent with nature than slavery because we have an obligation to take these heathens out of their darkness and so on. It constantly told you that we human beings are constantly negotiating values and revising them, but we are in a very nasty habit of generalizing our historical moment, our instantaneous sentiment onto all times, all places, forever. And that, talking about the role of divinity and so on, to me is entirely inconsistent with one's relationship with the divine, because if one's relationship with the divine does not humble your ego and temper your claim of knowing God's creation, which include human beings, and including all their different religions and faiths and cultures, then I don't know what your faith is doing. Then I really have serious questions about the role of that faith. I could go on forever.
Thank you very much. And please, the mic is open for those who want to ask questions.
Glenn Stassen. What you are arguing, I think, in your address, has a great parallel with what I had argued in the very first of our meetings, in which I argued that the human rights tradition precedes Rousseau and the French Revolution and so on, and goes back to faith and belief that it's God who gives. We're all created in the image of God. The Quran says the same sort of thing, and that God gives us these human rights as humans. And no state gets to choose. Those people are not humans, and these people are humans. We're all humans. So we all have these human rights. So I think I'm very similar in what I said Monday to what you're saying tonight. My question is, we keep hearing in our media, say like in Egypt, that there are, on the one hand, the Muslim Brotherhood, who seem quite authoritarian, and not so respectful of other party positions as being a part of the government, and so on. So they don't really get the human rights of participation, on the one hand. And on the other, there are the secularists, and which I would think the secularists are not a very friendly concept for Muslims who have faith. So do you have a label for what you're saying? Aren't you saying something quite different from, on the one hand, the Muslim Brotherhood, and on the other hand, the secularists? Does it have a label?
One of the biggest tragedies, I believe, especially in Muslim countries, and it's very interesting when Arabic-speaking Muslim countries, as opposed to, for instance, Muslims in Malaysia or Indonesia or even Muslims in Australia or New Zealand or so on, in Muslim countries, it's quite remarkable, but they are still in an importation mode, in a constant intellectual importation mode. So what I mean by that is that every single term that is used to talk about Muslim Islamic movements originated with the West and was exported to the Muslim world. So for instance, fundamentalism, the word usuliyya, Islamiyya, originated in the West. Militant Islam, again, originated with, and even Muslims now, you find them using jihadi Islam, although any self-respecting Muslim would not use that term because it's a complete oxymoron. Jihadi Islam makes absolutely it's completely incoherent. And that, I say this because I've written an article about why the secular intelligentsia in Egypt betrayed the revolution. And I'll be happy to send it to you, but basically, the secular intelligentsia, which still lives with an intellectual, normative sense of the elite that formed and was created and left behind by colonialism. They think of themselves as representing the most liberal values, but yet is the same secular intelligentsia that supported Nasser and the horrendous human rights record, that supported the Ba'ath in Syria with a horrendous human rights record, that supported Saddam in Iraq again, that supported Muammar al-Qaddafi and his Kitab al-Akhdar, and supported the military coup in Algeria, and in every single one of them. And to me, the secular, this really embodies what I guess both of us are talking about. I haven't heard your lecture, but it's to my credit that I followed in your footsteps in my lecture. This notion of, well, human rights it's too unrealistic to talk about respecting the human rights of these people because we're not there yet. We have to first teach the sort of native, non-westernized individual. We have to first teach them that they have a false consciousness, very much like the Marxist life analysis, and teach them what rights are and what civic society is, and then we can get to a point where we can respect their human rights. And the funny, the sad and ironic thing, like all, as a person of faith, like all dynamics of evil, anyone who has brought the devil to do work that would ultimately lead to God, I would argue that I don't know of a single example in which they actually reach God. They always end up dancing with the devil, and they continue dancing until they're consumed by the devil, I guess. But that is the human rights paradigm that is essential, is to come in and say, darkness, regardless of what you do with it, will not produce light. A state of damnation, from, in our language, or state of being ignorant inside, ugly inside, regardless of how much you say, well, we have to be this way until we reach a point of grace, you're not going to get there. And we had a very concrete, this was debated very concretely in the community that I hang out with, so to speak, in the legal community, in the law school, about the issue of torture. Many people argued, well, we need to commit the ugliness of torture and so on because we have the just cause. From my perspective, your soul is not going to survive this dance with darkness. You ultimately will end up being as dark as those you set out to fight.
Thank you. Next question.